So let's talk about the big hitting Gravis anti-tank marines with Melta rifle firepower. How strong are Eradicators in current Warhammer 40k? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines and Eradicators in particular, doing an overview for the unit in game in current Warhammer 40k, with some of their pros, cons, power and combos on the tabletop. The Eradicators are the Gravis armoured Space Marines equipped with some great big Melta weapons. Gravis plate is the bigger and chunkier version of the Mark 10 Tacticus armour. Thicker plated armour that's employed when durability and raw might is going to be more important than speed and manoeuvrability. And for the perhaps often tactically flexible Space Marines, the Eradicators are fairly mono-purpose, armed with enormous Melta weapons and employed when the enemy is going to be fielding big lumbering tanks or monstrous creatures, where they alone might have the firepower to bring down some of the mightiest foes around. Their models first appeared for 9th edition Warhammer 40k, initially having some monopose ones in the Indomitus box set, though they followed up with a multi-part plastic kit fairly shortly after that. It's one of Games Workshop's 3 model elite box sets, so it tends to be a bit on the pricey side for the miniatures that you get within. $60, £38 or €50 for the 3 models. Fairly pricey relative to their points cost. The miniatures are fairly straightforward ones, big chunky Gravis Marines with enormous Melta guns that can be assembled with power feeds going into their backpacks. They have a few different variations on the gun that you can assemble, but mercifully Games Workshop just unified their profiles in one set of special rules rather than having very minor rules variations for the heavy Melta rifles. The only major wargear option in the box set though is having a multi-Melta 1x3, and in the age of 10th edition with free wargear it basically always makes sense to take that. They are available in a couple of other places as well. Games Workshop has an Honoured of the Chapter box set that comes with some monopose Eradicators, Blade Guard, and the Judas here. This is because they all shared one frame in the Indomitus box set. As Games Workshop's oddball online only things go, it is quite a popular one, but still not exactly a very feels-good kit, paying almost Combat Patrol prices just for 9 models, even if Games Workshop would have sold those characters for really quite a lot of money separately. As ever though, if you were looking to pick up some punchy Melta armed Space Marines, feel free to check out their channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. There's a whole bunch of examples from stores around the world, usually saving anywhere between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop's prices. And if you do happen to order through any of these specific ones after clicking the link in the video description, a small amount of profits help to support Auspex Tactics, so a big thank you to folks using those. Getting into the rules for the Eradicator squad in 10th edition 40k though. A Space Marine Eradicator squad is a generic Primaris Space Marine unit, so you can field it for both core Codex Space Marines and the Divergent chapters, 100 points for 3 of them or 200 points for 6. For their base stat line they have the fairly chunky Gravis armor profile, 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save, so basically small arms aren't going to be doing a massive amount to them, but still for 33 points per model it's not exactly really all that durable, and both special weapon fire and anti-tank fire will be really quite good targets against these guys. I certainly wouldn't really rate them as good durability per point. They're slightly slower moving than other Space Marines, only going 5 inches per turn, and don't have a lot of weight on objectives at OC1, and if they do happen to get into close combat they're not going to be a threat against most things. Just 3 attacks each at strength 4 and damage 1. Nothing to write home about there for Space Marines, but still may be able to bully a few light infantry if they want to. In a way though, being a unit with some clear weaknesses means that they have design room to have a good strength. They're neither super tanky for the cost, nor super fast, nor great in combat, so it does mean a lot of the time they might be one of the single most powerful units for their shooting. For the weapon profiles in the unit, they get the Melta rifle as their base loadout, 1 shot each at 18 inches, at strength 9, AP -4 and damage D6, and then 1x3 it makes sense to take the multi-Melta. You only hit on a 4+ for that one, but you get twice as many shots. So while on average against a target that you don't have your rerolls, a Melta rifle might average 0.66 hits, the multi-Melta averages 1. As with Melta weapons, they have Melta 2, so if they can get within 9 inches, they're going to inflict some serious damage on their targets. And then weirdly enough, they have the heavy keyword. I believe that was Games Workshop's idea for the heavy Melta rifle being rolled into the profile. In reality, that one's going to be kind of rarely used. Most of the time they're going to have to move to get in range or in line of sight, and even if they're on the board and in range they might still want to move to get towards objectives or get a little safer. If for whatever reason though they should be in the exact perfect place and they are able just to stand and shoot, they'll get +1 to hit. With those base profiles, the Eradicators wouldn't actually be all that good at handling tough monsters and vehicles. They wound them on 5s, which has always been a bit peculiar for Melta in 10th edition. But to compensate for that, the Eradicators get a really punchy rule called Total Obliteration. Each time you make a ranged attack against a monster or vehicle unit, you get to reroll the hit roll, wound roll and damage roll, which between the 3 of those just adds up to an absolutely spectacular offensive buff. Compared with not having the rule against, say, a toughness 10 monster or vehicle, you're doing around about 270% damage compared with what you would be before. So just spectacularly more scary than regular Melta weapons. It does have the downside though that against their prime targets, Oath of Moment isn't going to have a lot of effect. You'd get the boosted +1 if it's within Core Codex Space Marines, but it makes the full hit rerolls redundant. Putting that together with a rough damage output, being a bit conservative and presuming the Eradicator squad has to move to get within 18 range and can't get within 9, it's fairly tame against medium infantry, killing around about 1 or 2 Space Marines or around about 2 wounds average to Terminators, maybe 1 slain Terminator if you're lucky, but then really quite good numbers even at that range against things like Rhinos or Land Raiders. They've got a pretty reasonable chance to one-shot a Rhino or a Predator tank. It's 11 wounds to a Rhino, or around 6 or 7 wounds to a Land Raider, maybe being a fairly prime target as a high save unit. If they get within 9-inch range though and activate their +2 Melta rule, it goes to the next level. Against a toughness 9 vehicle with a 3+ save, you do around about 16 wounds, and then going up to 10 wounds or so against a Land Raider. Things like a Maleceptor with a 4+ invulnerable save would cause their damage outputs to fall off a bit though. I would bear in mind that these are average numbers, and compared with most Space Marine units they really are quite swingy indeed. For every single wound that you get through, you're probably going to inflict quite a lot of damage, though not guaranteed there. So there could be some massive conversions where they just absolutely wreck a unit and do something like 24 wounds to a knight in a single turn. We might have other times where you just get 1 wound through and then happen to roll low on the damage output. There's a good chance they either just wreck a vehicle or bounce. They do stack up rather well with the majority of Space Marine damage options. If you're taking aim at tanks and vehicles, then for the points invested, they compete really quite well with the gun tanks, per point being similar or better to a Gladiator Lancer and outcompeting most of the rest, though I would bear in mind that the others could make better use of Oath of Moment against their targets. If you can deliver Eradicators to under 9 inches though, then per point they tend to get ahead by a fairly silly margin. This one's weighted to 160 points worth of units, but most vehicles without invulnerable saves at that range are going to have a really good chance to get shot down in a single round. Before we move on to some Eradicator buffs and synergies, to talk about delivering that damage into range and maximising it, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice, makers of some custom crafted luxury dice for wargaming. Their main thing is to have a vast amount of different dice offerings that could fit in for various different wargaming factions out there, so ones with some generic designs that resemble various faction logos. And currently they have a fairly good discount sale going on for 15% off across their entire site if you use the code TREAT when at checkout. The range of dice is really quite extensive. They've got lots of ones that could fit in with various different Warhammer armies, and various ones that could fit in well for your powered armoured warriors out there. Their typical offerings tend to be 25 dice for around £29 or $35, though as mentioned a little bit cheaper at the moment with that code, and a lot of the dice have the option between squared or rounded corners depending on which one you prefer. They did make some channel merch dice for Auspex Tactics as well, so check them out if you'd like to pick some of those up. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one, and feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. Getting back to our already fiery Gravis Armoured Space Marines though, and Eradicators basically do feel like they're a unit with some big pros and cons. Their main strength is they are genuinely good at what they do. They're pretty terrifying against tanks and monsters, with some of the enormous and most efficient anti-tank damage for their points cost, and with the base profiles alone they won't be useless against sort of medium to heavy infantry. They've got some fairly good direct synergies that can help them out for certain Space Marine sub-factions, though all that does come with downsides. They're not that good durability per point, they're really quite slow and short ranged, so they need help to get range on their targets. Their damage is still far more inflexible than most, and can be quite swingy, particularly if the enemy has invulnerable saves on the go. They also don't really want to get locked in melee, which feels like a distinct possibility if they are operating on the front lines. One of the biggest questions for how they can work is how to get them there. Perhaps one of the most obvious ways might be transport inside a repulsor. They're 180 points and you can fit 6 Eradicators within the hold, potentially with character if you want to. This one makes really quite a big investment unit, but I feel like it does pair rather well with them. It's got some anti-infantry fire support that can handle the targets that they can't. Generally things that tend to be slow moving and not that tough work quite well with transport vehicles, so are a good match on paper there. It can help out with both problems. The special rule doesn't hurt for a bit of charge protection if the repulsor survives, and can have some additional synergy with the Firestorm task force. I'd say to get them into range, that's one of the single most obvious options. It might be a little bit less vital though if you're in a detachment that allows you to advance and shoot, so say Gladius Task Force or Firestorm there. You might have a bit more scope for being able to just burst out from behind ruins and lay into the enemy. Otherwise, just for a single unit of 3 of them, Strategic Reserve can make them a bit of a problem unit for the opponent. I feel like with their damage output, they're still a scary enough threat that you can't just completely ignore them. But moving tanks and monsters around and screening out just literally 400 points worth of models is probably not going to be too worth it either, so puts them in a bit of a difficult situation. Beyond that, a few chapters might have options for some interesting teleport or deep strike mechanics. Deathwatch with their teleportarium might be worth it, though it tends to be more efficient on their kill teams, They could be a squad for Uriel Ventress to deep strike, or potentially they could repeatedly return to reserves in Vanguard Task Force. Again, that could combo with Uriel Ventress's buff. For character support, this kind of depends on exactly how big and scary a squad that you're using. I'd say for a small squad of 3, it doesn't really make sense to put characters in. You're probably best off just keeping them cheap. Though if going for a 6-strong squad, it could make sense to add a character to really make sure they absolutely demolish their targets. The Apothecary Biologist is 70 points, and if you did want just a maximal threat 6-man squad, you can add lethal hits, and that's still really quite a good value add. Even if they reroll wound rolls due to their relatively low strength, they might often be wounding on a 5+. I think he is a bit overcosted at 70 points though, not really a super feels good character to put in the unit. I do think that he should be at least a little bit cheaper. If you wanted to add extra damage and also have the potential for an enhancement in the unit though, it's definitely an option. Otherwise, for leader characters, Marnius Calgar has actually been used for them a surprising amount in the past. He's more commonly seen with company heroes these days, but with Eradicators you actually make for a weirdly interesting unit. They're a bit tankier due to the Victrix guards taking hits. He gives them advance and shoot, and then you basically have a squad that's both an absolutely enormous threat, both in shooting and in melee, and can be a difficult problem unit to deal with. I've seen the odd list decide to infiltrate them with an Apothecary Biologist in the unit as well in Vanguard Task Force, and that will make a terrifying unit, but also one that costs around about 500 points. In reality, putting Calgar with them is going to be a niche tactic, but isn't as far from viability as many might guess. Otherwise, and perhaps one of the more obvious ones, is Vulcan Hestan. The Forge Father of the Salamanders can't join them directly, but he can mark targets for them. It's not going to be relevant against big tough monsters and vehicles where they already get all the rerolls in the world, but he can give them reroll wounds against things like heavy infantry, and that could be a big deal if they're, say, fighting against Dark Angel's Deathwing or Custodes Terminators, though whether or not it makes most sense to buff the Eradicators versus other things like Infernus Marines or Land Raider Redeemers will depend on the rest of the list and the enemies. Otherwise, for characters, there's a few more things that can join them. You could put a Gravis Captain with them, but feels like a bit of a mismatch really. He's probably better off with Aggressors given his combat profile. And otherwise you could put Tor Garadon, Ironfather Phyros, or as mentioned, have Uriel Ventress deep strike them. None of them feel like an absolutely awful idea, but all probably feel better with other things, particularly with Tor Garadon wanting to get into melee, Ironfather Phyros wanting to hang around near vehicles. Maybe out of those, Uriel Ventress of the Ultramarines feels like one of the more tempting ones if you're not using it on something else like a big stacked up Hellblaster combo. For detachment buffs though, that feels like one of the single biggest wins for the Eradicators, in particular for the Firestorm Task Force or the Forge Father Seekers for the Salamanders. These detachments work absolutely great for them on a number of levels and just really takes them from being a bit more of a run-of-the-mill Space Marine units to a standout one. Advance and shoot is exactly what they want for those shorter range weapons and a slower movement characteristic, and then it can also buff their damage against a number of important targets as well, going to strength 10 within 12 inches. That's a pretty huge damage buff against things that are toughness 9 and 10, and also useful against Terminator profiles too. Just having that detachment rule on the go is easily enough to raise them to the next level, though they've got a few stratagems they could use as well. A +1 to wound along with those wound rerolls is pretty huge for them. There's one for getting out of a transport and return fire, and they definitely have enough damage to make that sort of threat felt. Pretty massive to potentially be destroying an enemy vehicle in their turn. And then in Forge Father Seekers, you have access to fallback and shoot, which I think is really quite a nice one for close range fire support, and a big win for the Salamander specific version of that. Otherwise, for the other core detachments, some are a bit more helpful than others. The Gladius core rules for advance and shoot and fallback and shoot can both help, as can reactive moves. I'd probably rate this as their other strongest attachment, and you could use Fire Discipline if you're going for a big combo unit with an Apothecary Biologist. Vanguard or Shadowmark, I'd say, is another interesting one. Cover and stealth aren't bad benefits for a ranged unit that's likely going to be popping up and then taking damage. Return to reserves could be a useful one to them to get their Melta guns into something else if they do survive. And then Shadowmark Talon has fallback and shoot as well, again useful for the Eradicators to stop the enemy just shutting them up by charging them with some chaff. The other ones maybe feel a bit less standout. Ironstorm adds some rerolls from time to time, but not relevant against the tanks and monster targets. Anvil does have a few shooting stratagems, though they're unlikely to use the heavy bit of the rule. I feel like detachments, characters and transports are probably the most important synergies for them, but they could use other more generic Space Marine stuff. As mentioned, Oath of Moment I feel like isn't usually going to be the single most relevant thing for them, at least not when they're already getting full hit rerolls against tanks and monsters. Even there though, the +1 to wound could be at least a moderately big deal if you had no other better targets. For generic stratagems, Armour of Contempt is still going to be handy for them, though it might not be enough to save them giving sort of middling defense profiles. For the generic stratagems though, for one command point, Overwatch could be quite good in a pinch. It gets 2 reroll hit rolls against tanks and monsters even when it's not your turn, and that makes Overwatch far better than most. You can fish for the 6s. Space Marines do have plenty of fire support options as well. Incursors for a +1 to hit, Storm Speeders for various damage buffs, and other things like the Combi Lieutenant. For the Eradicators, they feel like they could be a bonus. I feel like they're not quite as trying out for Storm Speeder or Incurser style buffs compared with most, given their own big rerolls though. For use in current strong armies, I was interested to see how commonly they're played in competitive lists right now, and for that I did a quick survey of 35 high-placing Space Marine lists in tournaments, things that have won the vast majority of their games, and out of those only 4 lists chose to use Eradicators so far, so it does imply they're a bit on the niche side. Out of those 4 lists, 3 of them were Salamanders and then 1 was Ultramarines Gladius, most of them going for multiple units of 3 Eradicators, just the one going for a big 6-strong squad led by an Apothecary Biologist for an all-in repulsor delivered damage combo. Overall, basically for the most optimised lists around, most Space Marine lists are generally considering the Eradicators not to be super optimal for anti-tank purposes, though in Forge Father Seekers and Firestorm Assault Force it's a different deal, and they're very much a staple and widely played unit in that detachment. For the competition within the Codex, for dedicated anti-tank it often tends to come down to gun tanks and dreadnoughts right now. The Ballistas, Gladiator Lancer and Vindicator are played quite a lot, and Redemptors with Boosted Oath and Moment have got more play since the points cut. For heavy-hitting infantry firepower, Centurions and Inceptors seem to be the go-to units in Shadowmark Talon, both profiting enormously from being able to jump on and off the board. And then if you do decide that you want a Space Marine infantry damage combo on foot, there's still quite a lot of competitors there. Hellblasters with lieutenants, Stern Guard maybe with a captain for hybrid threat, or elite melee infantry such as Blade Guard plus Judiceer, or an aggressive damage combo. I feel like the Eradicators aren't necessarily weaker than those guys. Obviously it serves a different role depending on what you need, but I feel like they all have good niches, and you're not going to be able to field all of them in a Space Marine army. Overall though, I feel like Eradicators are in a fairly well balanced place within Space Marines, very much not auto-include for mainstream lists, though still usable enough, certainly so for casual games, and downright scary if you do happen to be playing Firestorm or Forge Father Seekers. For how I'd be tempted to field them, I think I'd probably just go myself for just these small units of 3 of them, though clearly some people enjoy the big 6 with a character. 1 per 3 of them just gets a multi-melter as per the math, and then depending on the detachment you'd have to choose how you're going to try and coordinate them into their ideal targets. Gladius or Firestorm could just have them being a sort of counter-attack, advance and shoot unit, hiding behind terrain and jumping out. The other places could have them as a disruptive reserves unit. We could have units jumping out of a repulsor or even a Land Raider Redeemer. Obviously they'll love Firestorm, and basically their game plan is going to be all about trying to jump on the biggest, nastiest enemy units, ideally hitting stuff with high toughness, high saves, but maybe not an invulnerable save if they get a choice. If they can hit them within 18 inches, then all well and good. There's still going to be good damage output there, but big bonus points if you do manage to get them to within 9-inch Melta range. After that, there is a pretty reasonable chance they'll get hit back hard and prioritised by the opponent. If you have any sneaky tricks that could allow them to survive, such as reactive moves or the repulsor to pull them out of the way, then that's going to be quite a big deal. But a lot of the time they might be very swingy one-hit wonders. If you have a choice as well, I'd probably fire them early in the shooting phase as opposed to later, just due to how swingy their damage output could be, and just give them the chance they could surprise you and just wreck something straight out. If you happen to be in a matchup where their damage output just isn't great, they're probably going to change role a bit and just be used as a more expendable Space Marine unit, and even just use them a little bit more sacrificially and screening purposes, as opposed to worrying too much about their damage output, and have your other units take precedence for damage. In any case, let me know what you make of the Eradicators. Have they been making their way into your list these days? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. A big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring this one. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their range. And if you do pick up anything, then use those Halloween codes, either Treat or Haunt I believe they are, to save 15% off any purchase. That's about it for this one. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this though. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.